right now we're going to talk about returning carbon to the ground. But before we get started, I wanted to do kind of like a level set question. So raise your hand if you understand what I mean by carbon sequestration in soils. Yes! Okay, good. Okay. Raise your hand if you don't really know. That way it'll be easy for me to see. Don't really know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. Such a liar. Okay, great. So raise your hand if you don't know what regenerative farming is. Okay, cool. That sets the stage.
What are we doing here? Almost everybody knows.
Yeah. Well, it's good. So we'll clear it up for those of you who don't really know, and hopefully, you will be able to ask questions. Of course, same format as before. This is a conversation between all of us. Christoph, again, will be walking around with the microphone. So yeah, I'll kick it off. I'll just do a quick introduction. So Keith Berns here is with Grow Cover Seed. And
Green Cover Seed.
Oh, Green Cover Seed, excuse me. And they make custom mixes of cover seeds for hundreds of farmers. So glad that you're here. Chris Kerston is with the Savory Institute and working on, you guys have your secret sauce of how to verify that carbon has been removed, and you're really working on, you're the communications director, and you're working on how to get these farmers who have adapted regenerative practices paired with buyers in their supply chain who want to use this as part of their branding, we're the sustainable cereal. And Dorn Cox here is a farmer, also a co-founder of Farm OS, and the research director for the Wolf's Neck Center for Agriculture and Environment.
Got it.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to kick it off with what's the difference between regenerative farming and what typically we call agriculture? Who wants to do that one? Just for the people, the 6 people who don't know.
Yeah, I'll dive in on that first, and we can riff off that. But for us, regenerative agriculture is having measurable, quantifiable, net positive results on the land while still producing products for human use and consumption. So without compromising on the quality and on the quantity of products that are being produced for human use, that we're actually making the land better at the same time. And so that's kind of a mouthful, but when you think about where we are as a species, we have a growing population and a planet that's sick. The only nexus to bring those back together is regenerative agriculture. We have to make our land better while we feed and clothe the world. So that, for us, is regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, but what does make our land better? What's wrong with our land? I know the answer to that question.
And I'll answer that. I mean, what's wrong with our land is we've lost more than half of the carbon that used to be in the land. The organic matter has disappeared. Much of it has eroded and washed away. And I would add, with regenerative agriculture, we're regenerating 3 things. One would be the soil, the whole soil health movement. 2 would be people. We're looking at human health because that could solve so much of that. But number 3 that often gets overlooked is we need to regenerate these small agricultural rural communities because they're really dying off. And if we would get back to more of a regenerative agricultural system, we'll see the revitalization of a lot of these communities as well.
So what do you mean by organic matter is disappearing from our soils? Is it magic? Where does it go? What's happening?
Well, organic matter is a combination of all these nutrients. It's 58% carbon, then there's nitrogen and sulfur and all these other things that make up organic matter. It's very stable, and once carbon is in that state, it's very stable within the soil. And it's a real shame that Dr. Lal couldn't be here because he's probably one of the world's foremost experts on organic matter. But it is the number 1 most important thing about a soil. And when you have organic matter in your soil, that farm will be the most productive, and more importantly, it will be the most resilient. It'll be able to get through droughts. It'll be able to ward off insects and diseases. And so organic matter gets lost through processes like tillage, erosion.
What's tillage? It's plowing.
Yeah, plowing,
We're going to
disking.
share this video later, and there are people that I would like to know, like,
Yes.
what is tillage?
So anything that disturbs the soil, because basically what you're doing is you're oxidizing it. You're exposing that carbon to oxygen, and you're oxidizing it, and it goes to the atmosphere as CO2. And quite frankly, some of the organic matter that has been lost is now floating around, and that's, we need to get that carbon back where it belongs, back where it originally was, and that's in the soil.
So David Montgomery yesterday in our general how to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere panel said that a third of our CO2 or carbon emitted into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution has come from plowing of our lands. And so that has added to global warming, and it's also contributed to erosion of our lands. And so what I'm hearing here is that there's enormous co-benefits between adopting these regenerative farming practices by not plowing your land and actually reversing climate change. So that's a big deal. We need to have better farmland for foods, and we need to improve that for farmers and for ourselves. But we also need to reverse climate change. It's just a win-win situation. So I want to knock it over to you, Dorn, and ask this question: is what exactly is it that we need to do?
Well, I think you've queued it up very nicely. The real challenge, I think, is to shift our mindset from thinking about agriculture as a business to agriculture as a living system and the foundation for a regenerative economy. And when we do that, I think it starts to shift our mindset as far as how we treat this, because the soil is really a living system. And it's unique as an asset in that as we use it, we can actually improve it. How many other assets do you know of other than essentially our collective knowledge that exhibit the same property? And in fact, I think they're deeply tied, essentially, that our collective knowledge of this system actually is what advances our understanding and ability to manage that natural system. And I've often said that agriculture isn't as complex as rocket science, it's actually more complex. Because we're dealing both, as you said, with human systems, biological systems, and are essentially the tools we use to manage those, which are essentially a reflection of every piece of technology we have to address the way we influence our environment. And that's what agriculture is. And so that being said, there are some basic principles that we can use to get soil to rebuild that biological system that we're assist. And as David also pointed out, we can go beyond what the previous natural state was. We don't know, in fact, how high we can go, but we know we can go further. And in fact, what we have to harness are millions of years of evolution, abundant carbon in the atmosphere, water vapor, and nitrogen, and taking that complexity, using essentially the tools we have to communicate with one another, which are only a few thousand days old, millions of years, few thousand days old, to apply that to the soil. And there's some 4 basic principles that we now have, that we're now applying within the USDA with the Soil Health Division. That's basically, you can divide it down to even 2: to protect and to feed. So to protect is not tilling. So tilling accelerates the decomposition process. It also breaks up a lot of the fungal networks that we're now just discovering because of the biotech revolution. But also keeping a mulch cover layer to protect. So we're dealing with a living system, and the hot sunlight and all the other in the process is not a very hospitable environment for life. So to cover and to protect it from rain and other environments is important. And then to feed, if you think about it as a living system, just like your own microbiome, you need a diverse diet. So you need living roots, and then you need diversity. So to protect and to feed. And that's essentially the process of taking atmospheric carbon, photosynthesizing it, feeding it to the microbiome, and developing deep roots. And the faster we can do that, and the more days of photosynthesis, and the more we can accelerate the process at that microbiology level, the faster we can actually accumulate carbon and generate all these other services. Because it's going to lower input costs and it's going to increase water capacity, increase resilience. So what we need to do to adapt to climate change in the meantime is also what we need to do to mitigate it over the long term.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think a lot of people who probably aren't in this room, who aren't experts, would ask, like, why do we plow if it's so terrible? And people have known this. It's not like a new thing that plowing erodes lands. And now we're understanding with a bigger impact in terms of climate change. How do we grow our food without plowing? And are there specific types of crops that we could only do without plowing?
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in on that and take a step back on the David Montgomery point about emissions. That's since the Industrial Revolution. We've been talking about emissions a lot in the last day and a half. If you look at the total emissions, the pool that's in the atmosphere right now of carbon-based compounds, and you go back in time, if we go pre-Industrial Revolution, humans have been putting carbon in the atmosphere long before we were burning fossil fuels. It goes back the last 10,000 years. The only solution for that is to put it back into the soil. The only option that scales, that's viable, that will work quickly enough in our timetable, what we need to do is to put that back in the soil. That doesn't mean that we abandon some of these cool technologies, these drawdown technologies that are coming out there, but I struggle to see how those really scale and have financial viability in the short term. So coming back to that kind of full circle approach, if we can take carbon out of the atmosphere and we can put it into the soil where it's a source of fertility. It's not a liability. The other pool that we see so much of it going into is the ocean. It's a liability there, just like it is in the atmosphere. We form carbonic acid, the oceans are dying. Goes into the soil gets more fertile, life begets more life. We now have that fuel to grow more and more things and become more productive. So our land can become more productive, but I wanted to go back to your point. I don't focus on cropping as much, and I think that's where your question was. I focus more on livestock. But just about the total system of how the system currently operates and the way that commodity markets work, farmers and ranchers want to do things different. I can tell you firsthand, all three of us have worked in farming and ranching our careers. I can tell you firsthand they want to do things differently. Right now it's an oligarchy. Every community has one buyer for most of the crops. That's their only option to sell to. And right now the system that we as consumers, as a collective pool, are demanding is cheap and fast food. And that's what the system produces. When we collectively, grassroots, can shift that and reach a tipping point, they are ready. And it's already happening now. And we've been on the forefront of that, as Alexsandra said, working with brands that want to lean forward into that, and with producers that are already doing it, that right now are selling commodity. We work with thousands of producers around the globe that are healing their lands, that are making their lands better in a demonstrable way, that are selling in commodity markets because there aren't options for them right now to differentiate with elevated claims. So.
And I'll address your question about plowing. You know, in the beginning, you know, when the plow was first developed and people started breaking the land, it made the land more productive, mainly because in the process of oxidizing the carbon, it also released the nitrogen. Because remember, organic matter is not just carbon, it's only 58% carbon. So the carbon gets put into the atmosphere, but the nitrogen, sulfur, all of those other nutrients became available for the plant. So farmers would see an immediate impact after tillage because all these nutrients were released. Well, they didn't understand the science well enough to know that they were essentially burning down the house, to cook a meal, is essentially what they were doing. And over time, then that no longer was able to work. And so then they had to start adding the synthetic fertilizers because we'd mined out so many of the nutrients that were native in our soils with all of the organic matter.
So you're just chasing your tail.
Yeah, and
tillage,
tillage is often said it's a weed control thing. You can control weeds, but we have just as many weeds now after 10,000 years of tillage as we ever had, probably more. And so it's
Dorn.
Well, and I would just like to add that I think, as I said before, tools are a reflection of our understanding of the environment, and we observed that it worked. We didn't have the insight that we now have of the microbiome and the actual processes that we're setting into play. And I think that's where we actually are on the cusp in the last decade of being able to really understand some of that complexity. And instead of looking at agriculture again from sort of a homogeneous and scaling by creating essentially simplicity, and a homogeneous system that is easily mechanized. We have the potential with technology, information technology and communications technology to actually mass diversify and manage the complexity that we are otherwise, it was just even from a research perspective, we did replicated block trials and controlled everything and to make the math easy. That's no longer a limitation. We can actually, and in fact, it's we're at the science. This is directly relevant to why we plow, but we're at the point where we can now do massive on-farm trials, where every farm can essentially become a research farm, and we get replication through, through massive participation. So I think that's the real potential here, and to do things like start to understand the dynamics of cover crop cocktails that are additive and are used to substitute for mechanical transplanting. So we can substitute biological processes like cover crops that winter kill and create a mulch in place, so we can, instead of plowing and tilling, we can actually put the next generation of crop in directly. And so it's a much more complex process, and to understand it is even more complex.
Yeah, so there's a lot of complexities in how you would grow it and how you would do it. So let's, maybe Chris, what are some of the big barriers? I mean, you're saying that there are a lot of people, farmers who want to do this, who want to adopt regenerative farming practices. What are the barriers? Like, what's stopping everybody from doing it?
Yeah, a huge part of it is authenticity and then supply chain. So I'll break that down a little bit. We've been training ranchers how to measure their land health across an aggregated comprehensive score over the last 30 years. And over the last 4 years, we've broken that down and made it even more empirical and more robust. But basically, we teach producers how to look at their land health in a way that creates a feedback loop for them to implement better and more innovative management. But now we've added to that some lagging indicators, some things that are important to brands, to NGOs, to marketplaces that have an impact score. So we're looking at things like carbon, water, soil organic matter, biodiversity, ecosystem function. We look at 30 data points on the land, and all of that gets rolled up into what we call an ecological health index, and then we trend that index over time. And so we can see how properties are getting better and worse, both on individual metrics and on a whole aggregate altogether. That's happening, that's scaling. We have supply, we have producers out there that are doing it, and we have brands out there that want to access it. So we've got that authenticity piece taken care of, but now the brands, who are currently, most of them, if we're all honest with ourselves, greenwashing. They're all trying to squeeze the most amount of brand halo they can out of what little access they have to great story and authenticity, and make the most out of that. And we're now connecting those that are leaning the furthest into that space, saying, hey, we've got this supply down here, but for most products, most of CPG, consumer packaged goods, there's tremendous amount of steps along the supply chain. And so we're trying to create a power purchase agreement, multi-stakeholder situation to where the brands are actually investing in supply chain, rather than investing back with premiums, which the law of diminishing returns and economics tell us premiums become norms, norms become discounts. They're not perennial. Can we create perennial change in a local ranching community, these rural communities? Can we bring back perennial change there with investment from the brand there that creates long-term lasting change? But the devil's in the details of supply chain. There's a tremendous amount of supply chain logistics, infrastructure, and processing that needs to get dealt with that currently isn't getting enough attention and being talked about.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that farmers, in addition to the incentives of adopting these practices for increasing the health of their land and the longevity. Goodness, I know this word. Longevity of their lands need to be incentivized.
Yeah, I think as we develop new markets like this, those incentives can come from the ecosystem services that these farmers and ranchers are already doing, that right now they're currently getting no credit for. They're just doing it for increased productivity and resiliency. If that can replace current premiums. Let's look at organic as a model for a second, because I think organic's great. In fact, my partner, she works in organic certification. But if we look at them as a model, they say, here's what you're allowed to do, here's what you're not allowed to do, and then we assume good things happen. So you have to kind of prove yourself innocent, which is just the nature of where the politics were 30 years ago. It's just the first step, the baby step that we had to take. But the way that system emerged is that the producer has to pay to prove their own innocence, which means they're dependent on a premium in the marketplace. As that premium dissolves over time, as the system reaches scale, now they bear that overhead, which is a new cost of doing business that's actually a burden long term. And we're talking about systems. We look at things in such short term. It's the same reason we till. We're trying to look at things in long term. So as that premium goes away, now they're stuck with just this new way of doing business. And so what we're saying is, let's flip the script on its head a little bit and say, the premium now comes from the benefits you're providing to the environment from a whole new pool of funders out there. That becomes the premium. The brand, instead of paying a direct premium to the producer, pays an investment in supply chain in that local region.
I think another impediment to farmers adopting a lot of this is government policy and the current state of where, particularly crop insurance. Crop insurance basically encourages farmers, and especially in my area where I'm from, Nebraska, corn soybean rotation is heavily incentivized. And the way that we farm, we're a far less risk to the crop insurance system than my neighbor who maybe does a lot of tillage and isn't using cover crops. But yet we pay exactly the same rates on crop insurance. So within that system, there's no incentive for my neighbor to do any changing because he pays the same premium as I do. He has the same essential base guarantees as what I do. So I think we need to shift some of the incentives over to the direction that we want farmers to go.
Or creating incentives by paying them for the carbon that is sequestered into their soils
that
with
would
this
work
thing
too.
called the Nori token.
That's right.
In a Nori carbon removal marketplace. I see that. Dorn, did you?
I was just going to add that I think it's that financial incentive is an important piece to drive change and innovation towards that goal. There are intrinsic values in doing it, but the social and complexity, the social process of shifting production practices with that as a primary goal is going to take longer without additional incentives. And so I think in addition, I think one of the important things is to foster that innovation because it is a knowledge intensive rather than input intensive process of shifting, which means it's a social process, it's a human process. Soil health in general is about management, which means people. So it's really about networks and accelerating the exchange of knowledge that will really facilitate that. And part of that knowledge, coupled with financial incentives and innovation, is really important. And I want to also reiterate that I think that the innovation is going to happen at the farm level and feed up. It has to. There's no other way going forward. This is not something that can come from a university. It has to come from the landscape.
But it also has to, it has to happen at the farm level. But it has to be incentivized and supported by all the people who are being fed by these farmers, which is the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So it's both parties coming together and supporting each other in this shift.
And I would say that agriculture is part of the shift in agrarianism is that everybody sees themselves as part of the system, that it's not the farmers out there on their own, as you said. It's a shared human endeavor, and our collective capacity to increase the total production is where we can share and create pre-competitive space. And let's think about global knowledge about how that system works, and let's compete on the production and innovation only.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes or 18. Let's open it up to the floor. We've got, I'm sure, very good questions.
Okay, Alden.
Back in the day when I was starting to do this, even when we got everything else right, the pricing mechanism, the contract, the reward, I found, to my surprise, a big barrier to moving forward was just the distribution network and distributors that don't like having multiple crop rotations because they'd rather have the same contract with the same guy for the same commodity year after year. Is that still an issue, or is it was a real issue back then? Has that started to disappear, or?
I think it's definitely still an issue. Again, I don't work on the cropping stuff, but I mean, looking at livestock as an example, so I'll use leather as a case study here. So leather has more margin in the marketplace than any of the other products that come from livestock, but it's a waste product from the meat industry. There's not a contract leather grower on the planet. So they produce meat or they produce dairy, and then when the cull cow's gone, goes to the market, now you pull this hide off and it goes into this long amorphous supply chain. What we found in bringing brands together, both from textile, apparel, food, all together in one space, is that we kind of accidentally stubbed our toe in what we're calling a whole animal project now, to where one brand says, well, I'm going to take the bones for this new broth company that I'm doing. Somebody else says, I'm going to take the middle meats for the whole food case. I've got the trim for a snack bar, and now I'm going to take the leather and maybe even the hair. So like, I didn't even know this, but like bison hair is like the new cool hipster like stuffing for puffy jackets. Is like, there's all these cool new markets emerging where I think bespoke and innovation and scale are all kind of at this interface. So yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of innovation that has to come around. If you want someone to make a rotation or utilize an underutilized good, you have to create a market for that as well, so that they're not disincentivized by doing this.
I think on the cropping side, a lot of it comes down to so many farmers are so big now, they don't have the ability to manage multiple crops, because you can't get to large scales and be growing 8, 10, 12 different crops. And so as a necessity of expansion, the amount of things that you're growing has shrunk. And so again, we need to change that somehow if we're going to address that.
Yeah, and I would address we're at a really unique time because of the technology we have in terms of in communications, that we have much more access to direct markets, not just locally, but regionally and even globally. And so the ability to collectively aggregate diverse products in a region and have much smaller economies of scale and still have it function,
Yeah.
I think is really dramatic, and it's something that our farm, we're an East Coast farm north of Boston. We're selling to 75 restaurants and institutions directly, and when it arrives with 12 other farms, and when it arrives at any of the hospitals or schools, it looks just as if they bought it from Cisco, and they have just as easy an interface to order it. So again, so that's democratizing access to essentially a global marketplace. And so I think there's a lot of innovation, and I think the supply chain companies are adapting to that as well. But I to some extent, I think it's going to have to be an adaptation.
I'll ask a quick question. Is there a threshold size for farmers to adopt regenerative practices? Like, is there too big? To your point.
Oh, it depends on what their management team looks like. It depends on what their management ability looks like. I know farms 10,000 acres that are doing it and doing it well. That's the exception and not the rule. Probably 1,500 acres and below, it's probably quite a bit easier for a single operator, a single manager to handle that.
Everything in our movement is called holistic management. Everything is about context and understanding, making the best decisions for you, employing the best management practices for you. And so I would say it's a context answer to your question. But nature is inherently regenerative. Nature is the whole planet. And so I don't think it's an issue of scale. I think we get caught up on scale and practices far too often and less on outcomes. And we can intentionally create the right outcomes. But I actually hear the other one, because we work on large landscapes. It's what we do. So I hear that less often about it too big, but the one I hear is too small. And I love that David Montgomery yesterday said garden plot. I mean, if there's an old Chinese proverb that if we all swept in front of our own houses, the whole world would be clean. And I think it's the same for regenerative. If we all took our part and took care of our piece of land and what we stewarded, I think it could be the same way.
I would add that part of the intention of global land restoration is also to repopulate our landscape. The solution, the problem has been human-induced land degradation. The solution is actually human-based land stewardship and repopulating our degraded landscapes and making them more productive so that we can sort of reverse and have actually a high quality of life connected to our urban centers, but really addressing, I think, some of the global migration issues by restoring these areas, because we have essentially an unlimited level of complexity and that we need to manage, and it takes people to do that at some level, and especially when we're talking about regenerative systems. So,
all right, so I'm gonna throw a hard one at you. Ready? So let's say I'm a Midwest farmer, decent size, corn, soybeans, right? That's probably the majority of agricultural output, or a good portion of it, in the United States. I recognize that's not your prosumer. We kind of talked about this yesterday. But in order to have large-scale change, that something has to change. Cover crops aren't ideal necessarily for that rotation naturally. No-till works in some places, but not others. No-till is an example within that population where there has been change over the course of 20 years. That's a unique space, actually, where things have changed. I'm also probably conservative, and I probably don't like to talk about climate change, right? Convince me that I'm going to go from 0.5% or 1% carbon, which is probably what I'm at now, higher than that. How does that work? Do those have to go away? Do they change? Do their kids take over? Like, there's a reality. It's not a trivial question. You're talking about scale. That's who you're scaling to, and I want to hear your perspectives about how that works.
I'll take that because we deal with that every day, and trying to sell cover crops primarily to corn, soybean farmers. And again, part of it is that's a mentality that they're locked into, partially because of government programs, partially because of tradition. So there's other things that we could do to get them to switch. I don't think you're ever going to get farmers to adopt these technologies by saying, we want you to help save the environment. That's not the approach. The approach is, hey, look, there's all this free plant food out there. All you got to do is get it into the soil, and it's going to benefit you greatly. As an example, and this is one thing that I tell people on our farm, just to put some numbers to it, in 25 years of doing no-till, we basically increased our organic matter levels from 1.5% to 3%. That's about 10 tons of carbon per acre. So across 2,500 acres, that's significant. Now, that has increased our productivity of that ground probably by 30 or 40%. And so you can't ever convince farmers to do this from an environmental standpoint. It's not that they're opposed to that, but that's not their first concern. And there's mutual benefits. If everybody, there's about 900 million acres of farm and ranch land in the United States. If everybody did what we did and increased by 10 tons over the last 25 years, that's over 9 billion tons of carbon sequestered. But again, the big thing isn't for the farmers, it's not the environment. It's like, hey, you just now got 30 to 40% more productive. Every percent of organic matter will store 25,000 gallons of water per acre. And in my area where we're very dry, that is a huge, huge deal. The water retention, the better infiltration. So it has to be approached from an agronomic standpoint of, if you do this, then here are the benefits that are going to accrue. So that's, we can explain that, but it has to be coupled with some changing of incentives and programs. Now, we can also say, if you do this, here's a side benefit. You can get paid, this is valuable to you, but how cool would it be if you get paid to actually put it in the soil? But it has to be approached as kind of a side benefit, which it is. And if you can get paid to do that, so much the better.
So let's put some context to it. How much of our farmland or how many of our farmers are actually adopting these types of practices?
It's a spectrum.
Very low number.
It's a very low number.
It's a low number, but I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a spectrum. It's not a threshold or a binary response of like, we're conventional and now you're regenerative. It's a journey through that.
But I would say the acceleration of adoption of practices is what I would look at, because it's really a function of knowledge exchange, and I think your business is actually a reflection of the growth of that and the awareness of cover crops. And beyond just USDA subsidized acres and cover crops, but we saw After we started in our area, New England, after we did cover crop trials around the state, we saw an 11 times increase in cover crop acres in 3 years. So it was a huge acceleration, and it's about this farmer-to-farmer observation, neighbor to neighbor, talking about it. And so I think that is happening. That's what the Soil Health Partnership is doing, and many other initiatives that are really farmer network based that are accelerating that process. So it's a network of networks that I think is
Yeah, and I would say over 50% of farmers are doing some facet of that. They maybe have some no-till, but they're not continuous no-till. They maybe have dabbled in some cover crops or some crop rotation, but for the ones that are doing the complete system, that's still a relatively small number.
So we need to increase those numbers. I want to get another question because we're going to be done in about 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is related to that. If I offered $500,000 to a farmer with 2,000 acres for equipment, direct seed or whatever, and I required him to do no-till or single pass, low disturbance cropping for 10 years, would he take that deal, and would that increase adoption of those practices? Or is it, again, just a side payment that would be a benefit, but there's a lot more convincing that would take place? So I'm just wondering if on the margin you'd get a lot more adoption, or to what extent would you accelerate that?
So this is where I think we get hung up on the practices, because is your goal for him to implement him or her to implement the practices, or is your goal to get the outcome? If your goal is to get the outcome, incentivize that. Don't go to farmers and say, these are the practices that you should be doing. Go and say, these are the outcomes we as a collective society want, and let them unleash their own innovation to get there.
Yeah, the problem with that though is, and this is in some of these projects, you can't measure the soil carbon in the first few years. So there has to be some practice-based guidance that would allow at least crediting or some sort of, at least so you could evaluate risk, so that you can put that money up front.
There's no doubt that the carbon science is changing all the time, but I would argue that you can't start measuring right away, because we've been doing it.
But I wouldn't put money up front if I didn't have some confidence that those farmers were going to be doing certain things that I could be confident that in 5 to 10 years there's going to be carbon there. And so that's where there has to be a combination, I think, of practice and modeling, so that you can extract that money up front, as well as long-term measurement, which you can then calibrate the models as well as calibrate the amount of carbon. But it gets the money coming in because you've got some evaluation of risk up front. Anyway.
I would like to sort of qualify that there's intrinsic value in a lot of these practices, and agronomic value at the farm level, and to the extent that we're using soil, if we're testing for soil health to improve these practices for the farm level anyway, that's also creating the data set that we need for baseline documentation. And so the marginal cost of it is really zero from building the baseline for ecosystem service markets in the future. And so I think the more we can create tools that are data driven, that are beneficial to the farmer, the lower the cost is for, again, those margin, that additional value.
But we also need to increase the communication of that between parties, and I think Greg Ostick, who was up here earlier in the session before, with GOAT, that organization is focused on that, because you could have disparate data sources of different farmers doing different things.
Precisely, and that's why it's important to have those decision support tools done as part of an open source platform.
But what about the payment, though? As far as getting farmers to, let's say we can get comfortable with the science and knowing that, say there's going to be carbon there if you're doing certain practices. Does the payment get the farmers to convert something like of that scale, or is it more you're going to have to convince them that your land long term can be more productive, and then they'll implement the practice?
I think so. First of all, don't ever tell a farmer what he has to do. Farmers aren't normal people. You know, you have to approach them, and I can say that because I am one. You know, they don't like to be told what to do, and they don't like to feel like they're being bribed to do something. So yes, I think you have to show them the benefits long term for their own farm, and then also for society as a whole, and then say, we'll come alongside you and help you do this. You know, we'll provide, we'll provide the money to buy a no-till drill. We'll provide the money to do cover crops on every acre every year for the next 10 years. Show them how that money will be spent, and not just be throwing wads of money at them. You need to show them, this is specifically how we want to help you get to where we think you should be, or hopefully you think you should be as well.
Who is offering to buy a no-till drill for them?
Well, he was going to give a whole bunch of money up front.
I wanted
Well,
to.
we've been doing farmer cooperatives around that, so to be able to loan that equipment to get started, to prove it to your neighbor, and that's been very, very effective. Our conservation districts and the National Association of Conservation Districts and the Soil Health Champion Network has been a big part of sort of developing that social support for trying new practices and creating farmer-to-farmer communications. Because I think that's the trusted communication, and that's where the knowledge source about how to actually make this work really resides.
I just want to get the last question from the audience, because we are. Oh, man.
Yeah, sorry. I just have a quick follow-up.
Sorry, guys.
Playing devil's advocate on the idea of who's paying for this, because Chris, specifically, you said that brands are greenwashing, and yet at the end of the day, farmers aren't getting paid for it. But these brands that you say are greenwashings are the one fronting those big-ass checks. And so I just wonder how that's supposed to play into it when you have, I feel like us as consumers tend to vilify these companies that are, maybe they're trying to make money, but they're the ones who can instigate change because they have the money to do it.
They're writing the checks to who?
Yeah, I didn't understand that part.
To whoever. I mean, for example, Monsanto right now is incentivizing their farmers to implement better practices for their own farms. Companies are making changes.
My title is brand engagement, so working with brands and partnering with them is absolutely where I'm at. I think they're a huge part of the solution. What I was saying is that right now, they're trying to squeeze every bit of brand halo out of what limited amount of story is out there and what impact they can credibly tell, that it leaves the consumers wondering, gee, is this product good? Is this product good? They're not really left knowing what's out there. So we're saying if we had a verified product out there, that goes away, because now everybody has transparency that this product made the land better as a result of how it was produced. And absolutely, I think the brands have a huge role to play in being part of that solution. And I think they want to. I don't think brands are inherently evil. I think that they want to play a role in that right now. Most of them are confused. We don't know how to access better product, where to get it, how to process it, how to tell that story.
Last question.
You may have just answered my question, but I was wondering on what basis you're making the case to buyers to in fact invest in the supply chain, versus the investment in the product itself, and what kind of success you're having in making that case.
Yeah, so the crux of our whole multi-stakeholder agreement is that brands want to get product. However, as soon as you put a premium on cost of goods, they have to report that to their shareholders, and it looks bad for them. They have other funds, however, they can pull slush money from and put as part of other projects. It's CSR and marketing and other initiatives that they can move money around. So we're just trying to say, hey, can we get the intention that we want and create a better quality of life for this rural community by moving the funds that they have access to and more discretion over into that community, while at the same time creating a long-term agreement with stability for the brand to be able to access supply from a regionally distributed group of producers.
And is that sufficient? I mean, from what I'm hearing is you're saying you base it on stability, and you base it on their commitment to the resilience of the communities that are supplying them with their products. Is that sufficient?
It's contextual to each brand, of course. And again, we're working on a global scale. And so that creates challenges at each agreement. But what that does when you create a long-term agreement between both parties is then it allows us to pull the processors into that agreement, which then allows them to go for impacting, investing, and equity collateral out there to say, I'm going to use this agreement and go to a financer or to an investor and say, invest in my supply chain, because I am the processor for party A and party B to be able to make their transaction happen.
Yeah, it's interesting, because that also could be a way or a road to encouraging or incentivizing or valuing a long-term view versus a short or medium-term shareholder view.
We based a lot of it on how solar got developed. I mean,
Right,
that's kind
that's
of
what
the
I'm
original
seeing,
power
yeah.
purchase
That's
agreement.
exactly what I'm seeing.
And if you guys are curious about our program, it's called Land to Market. So you can go and look at the Savory Institute website and go to the Land to Market page.
I'm going to have to cut it off. We're going to have lunch for an hour and 15 minutes, have these conversations. That's what the summit is about. It's a summit, not a conference. Thank you so much to our speakers. I think we touched on the key concept here is that we need to get soil back into our ground because we need to we need to restore our lands, but we also need to restore our atmosphere. So it's a two-sided problem of how do we get the people who are consuming the food to support these practices and the farmers to adopt them and create an incentive structure, whether it be switching from premiums to investing in lands or providing, again, a Nori token, a Nori carbon removal marketplace. So thank you so much to our speakers.